One of the most interesting things we have here at Varnblog is that I get a lot of comments on X and on YouTube, often from well-meaning people who respond and don't realize there's a symptomatic failure in communication. So, for example, I received many comments about how we have to take justice seriously. Justice animates people. Justice moves the masses. The masses are moved by confirmation bias. What I find interesting about this is that I wasn't talking about the invocation of justice as a tactic. All right. In fact, I was critiquing the fact that people get confused by their ciphers, that they're not grounding their notion of justice in anything. And they're giving people what they think people already want, which will motivate people for a short time being until they realize that it's empty. Now, sometimes, in dire hope, you'll have a minority of the population cling on to that empty signifier, that cipher, far beyond when it's been shown to be incoherent or empty or hypocritical. And sometimes, actually, the power move is to make someone believe something contradictory. But the problem that I have when people respond to that, when I'm talking about grounding your own notions of justice, is that it confuses appealing to people's needs as a tactic that gets people highly motivated, which I acknowledged in the original reflection, and grounding those notions in something that you can convince people to believe in. And in that is the difference between virtue ethics and emotivism. All right. And it's also the difference between principled politics and Tailism. No one is telling you to abandon the appeal to justice because it is a useful rhetorical appeal. And if you can make that rhetoric meaningful, because you have grounded justice in something, you are selling an ethical and political vision. If you cannot do that, if you just think, well, meeting people where they are and making no demands of them is the way to become popular, what you are actually saying is, I want to reflect the status quo at you and flatter you with it. That's not actually a very useful politics, even for a demagogue, and for obvious reasons. When you try to change people or make demands on people, when you flatter them in this way, it becomes harder and harder to do. The successful demagogue, which seems to be what a lot of people have in mind when talking about why we need to appeal to justice so much, because it is so persuasive, knows the line between endorsing the status quo and endorsing change. And they often sneak into that line a counter elite, a counter status quo, a different element of the status quo, etc. But it's already there. So what you're taking from the sociological generalization that people respond to invocations of justice almost in every culture, because justice seems to be a concept that develops out of both feelings of fairness and order. But then you just say we have to invoke it. But you still haven't answered the fundamental problem. How do you make it meaningful other than fads? You're not the only person who's going to invoke justice to appeal to people's sense of fairness. Do you think that doesn't occur to everybody in the fucking political system? Law and order is based on a notion of justice. Social justice is based on a notion of justice. They're opposed visions. What they share is the sign of justice, a sign that we only know through familiar resemblances and their usage. And yes, it is highly sociologically motivating. People who say that are absolutely correct. My point is you have to be able to will your politics with the reality and material conditions that exist. So it is not just a question of will. It's a question of how far can you move the environment and the needle to make it so. But flattering people alone by appealing to their already inchoate notions of fairness masked as justice without grounding that in something larger, you will get pulled by what people want. You will be captured by your audience, and you will not be able to help them build up a vision of justice, which is possible to embark and place. And that's the problem with ciphers, is that if you use them forever, eventually, if there's any way to hold people accountable at all, they're going to start asking you to define the terms. And you don't ever really want to do that with a cipher. You want the meaning to be hidden. But my point is, if you want to offer people something like justice, you have to ground it in something else, in something more coherent, both in positionality, in terms of class, whatever, and in terms of relationship to other ideas, systems, and laws. Otherwise, if all you have for justice is the emotive responses of people, they will change on a dime and turn against you in a second. When material conditions even change a little bit, not even a lot. This is the problem with Tailism. This is one of many problems with emotivism. And this is problems with using sociological generalizations to justify confusing what is a rhetorical tactic. People like appeals to justice, so we should appeal to justice. That's a rhetorical tactic. And creating the substance in the category, which is almost as much about how you interact with the larger political subject than it is just what you're trying to get them to do. What most of you are saying is we should use justice as a cipher because it's effective, but effective for what? Vague vapors of social justice or any kind of justice are all over the general landscape. And people use them because they are rhetorically effective. It meets some need of the social band that is deep in our social being that probably goes back to our primate ancestry. It is almost innate in us. Of course, that is tactically useful. But without filling it out and placing it in its proper context, those tactical usefulness are just a power grab. And other people will do the same power grab. And when conditions change and you look weak or ineffective or unable to bring about justice, despite the fact that no one's even defined it or put it in relation to anything, so it doesn't really have a meaning. So it will be something used against you. This is why nebulous virtues lead to Saturn eating its children. The Republic of Virtue almost always goes this way. Because the virtues get emptied out, used to tail what people already think they believe, used to confuse them, not to demand any change of them. Justice is a hard thing, particularly if you want it to make sense. But the bigger issue here about emotivism and Tailism is you guys go, oh, but confirming bias is how you get the masses on your side. One, most of you have never got the masses on your side in your life. All right. So even if you know this is true, this cipher bias manipulation using ethical terms to hide other things to get people on your side without defining them or putting them in context of larger systems, even if you know that justice is useful and that maybe it's useful even without doing the other harder work I just mentioned, you forget that this can consume your political vision, and this doesn't answer for what. And for what is almost always the most important question. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 8 of After Virtue. Maybe it'll clarify some things for you. What managerial expertise requires for its vindication is a justified conception of social science as providing a stock of a law-like generalization with strong predictive power. One of those is people respond to justice, so we should always use justice because people respond to it more than other concepts. All right, that is a law-like generalization. It might therefore seem at first sight that the claim of managerial expertise can be easily sustained, for this conception of social science has been dominated the philosophy of social science for 200 years. And according to this conventional account, from the Enlightenment through Comte and Mill and Hempel, to the aim of the social sciences to explain specific social phenomenon by supplying law-like generalizations that do not differ in their logical form from those applicable to natural phenomenon in general, precisely this kind of law-like generalization to which the managerial expert would have to appeal. Many of you think of yourselves as rhetorical experts, speaking in and talking to the masses. But on the left, we have to be quite honest, you're not very good at that, even if you know the rules. Why is that then? If you know these generalizations are true, we'll get into why they might not be in a second, but even if they are, that you can't utilize them in a way that can compete with other notions of justice. If you can't make, let's say, a Marxist notion of justice versus a social justice thing, which is mostly vibes, versus law and order, which is mostly about law, if you can't answer that question, then what have you really put yourself on offer but reflecting back the biases of people in a society which already exists, which also would reflect back the status quo of that society? This account, however, seems to entail what is certainly not the case, that the social science are perhaps completely devoid of achievement. Excuse me, I missed it. Not different for those in natural phenomenon precisely because of the law-like generalizations to which managerial experts have to appeal. This account seems to entail what is certainly not the case, that the social sciences are almost or perhaps completely devoid of achievement. For the salient fact about these sciences is the absence of discovery of any law-like generalizations whatsoever. It is, of course, true that the claim is occasionally made that that at last a true law governing human behavior has been discovered. The only problem is that the alleged laws, the Phillips curve in economics, for instance, are C.C. Human's. If interactions between members of a group are frequent and in internal systems, sentiments of liking will grow between them, and these sentiments will turn into further interaction over and above the interactions of the external system. All turn out false, and as Stanislav Andreski has stringently pointed out in the case of Human's formulation, so unquestionably false that no one but a professional social scientist dominated by conventional philosophy of science would ever have been tempted to believe them. Given that the conventional philosophy of social science has asserted the task of the social scientist is the production of law-like generalizations, and given the further that social sciences does not produce generalizations of this kind, one might have expected a hostile and dismissive attitude on the part of many social scientists to the conventional philosophy of social science. Yet this has certainly not occurred, and I have identified one good reason for not being too surprised at this. It is, of course, that if social science does not present its findings in the form of law-like generalizations, the grounds for employing social science as expert advisors to governments or to private corporations become unclear, and the very notion of managerial expertise is imperiled. For the central function of social science as an expert advisor or manager is to predict the outcomes of alternative policies. And if his predictions do not derive from the knowledge of like generalizations, the status of the social scientist as a predictor becomes endangered. So, as it turns out, it ought to be. For the record of social scientists as predictors is very bad indeed, insofar that the record can be pieced together. No economist predicted stagflation before it occurred. The writings of monetary theorists have singly failed to predict rates of inflation correctly as early as Levy in 1975. And I don't think that's true. People might have explanations for inflation, but all the people who will say, oh, we predicted this, you go back 2 years later, and no, they didn't. And D.J.C. Smith and A.C.K. Ash have shown that the forecasts produced on the basis of the most sophisticated economic theory for the OECD since 1965 have produced less successful predictions than would have been arrived at by using common sense, or as I say, naive methods of forecasting the rate of growth by taking the average rate of growth for the last 10 years as a guide, or the last 6 months. Smith and Ash, 1975. One can go on multiplying the examples of predictive ineptitude of economists, which has only gotten worse with more advanced technologies and more econometrics, I may add. But this would be grossly unfair, for economists and demographers at least have gone on record with their predictions in a systemic fashion. But most sociologists and political scientists have no systemic record of their predictions. And those futurologists who scatter predictions lavishly around rarely, if ever, advert to their predicted failures afterwards. Indeed, in the notorious article by Carl Dutch, John Platt, and Dieter Senghor, Science, March 1971, where 62 alleged major social science achievements are listed, it is impressive that it is not a single case. It is that the predictive power of these theories listed, assessed in statistical terms. A wise precaution, given the author's point of view. That the social scientists are predictably weak and that they do not discover law-like generalizations may clearly turn out to be two symptoms of the same condition. By the way, we live in the replication bias where psychological social scientists did exactly this and had exactly this fallout. So when people are like, oh, we couldn't have seen this coming from the way we were using social science like generalizations and laws and TED Talks in the aughts and early aught teens, people saw the shit in the 70s. The social sciences are particularly weak, and they do not discover law-like generalizations may turn out to be two symptoms of the same condition. But what is that condition? Ought we simply to conclude that the predicted weakness reinforces the conclusion implied by the conjunction of conditional philosophy of social science and the facts about what social science do and do not achieve, namely, that the social sciences have substantially failed at their task? Or ought we perhaps instead to question both the conventional philosophy of social science and the claim to expertise by social scientists who seek to hire themselves out to governments and corporations? What I am suggesting is that the true achievements of social sciences are being concealed from us and from many social scientists themselves by systemic misrepresentation. Consider, for example, four highly interesting generalizations that have been advanced by modern social scientists. And we're going to this for a second. But I want you to think about how this relates to emotivism and Tailism. If you're making predictions off of how people respond in the vaguest way and confusing an invocation and critique of something as a principle as using something as a tactic, then what you're doing is bypassing the critique by invoking a vague sociological fact. Vague sociological fact, and one that may not always be a fact, depending on how justice as a concept is being employed. Anyway, let's go to the examples given by MacIntyre. The first is James C. Davies' famous thesis in 1962, which generalizes to the revolutions as a class. Tocqueville's observation that the French Revolution occurred when a period of rising and to some degree gratified expectations were followed by a period of setback when expectations continued to rise and were slightly disappointed. It's funny that I've been heard as a social science law goes back to an observation by Tocqueville and has never completely been proven. Neither has the immiserations thesis. We don't know the universal conditions which make revolutions successful or possible. Sorry. The second is Oscar Newman's generalization that the crime rate rises in high-rise buildings with the height of the building up to the height of 13 floors. but at more than 13 floors levels off. Newman, 1973. Wow, that's some correlationary shit. The third is Egon Bittner's discovery of the differences between the understanding of the import of law embodied in police work and the understanding of the same import embodied in the practice of courts and of lawyers. Bitter, 1970. The fourth is the contention advanced by Roslin and Ivo Farabend, 1966, that the most and least modernized societies are the most stable and least violent, whereas those at the midpoint in the approach to modernity are most liable to instability and political violence. The middle income violence revolution problem. All these things I still hear often repeated as truths. All four of these generalizations rest on distinguished research. All are buttressed by impressive sets of confirming instances, but they share three notable characteristics. First of all, they all coexist in their disciplines would recognize counterexamples, and the recognition of these counterexamples, if not by the authors of the generalization themselves, at least by colleagues in the work in the same area, does not seem to affect the standing of the generalization in anything like the way in which it would affect the standing of a generalization in physics or chemistry. Some critics from the outside of social scientific disciplines, historian Walter Langer, for example, 1972, have treated these counterexamples as affording reasons for dismissing both the generalization and the discipline that is so lax as to allow the generalization and the counterexample to coexist. So Langer has cited the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese Revolution of 1949 as examples refuting Davis's generalization and the patterns of political violence in Latin America as refuting Feyerabend's claim. For the moment, all I want to note is that the social scientists themselves, characteristically and for the most part, do in fact adopt a tolerant attitude to counterexamples, an attitude very different from that of the natural scientists themselves or of the Popperian philosophers of science, and to leave open the question of whether their attitude might not, after all, be justified. A second characteristic, closely linked to the first, of all four generalizations is that they lack not only universal qualifiers, but also scope modifiers. That is to say, they are not only genuinely of the form for all x and some y, if x has a property of theta, then y has the property of alpha. But we cannot say of any of them in any precise way under the conditions they hold. Of the gas law equations relating pressure, temperature, and volume, we know not only that they hold all gases, but the original formulations whereby they were held to hold under all conditions have since been revised to modify their scope. We now know that they hold for all gases under conditions except those of very low temperature and of very high pressure, where we can say exactly what we mean by very high, and very low. None of our four social scientific generalizations are presented with any such clauses attached. Thirdly, these generalizations do not entail any well-defined set of counterfactual conditionals in which the law-like generalizations of physics and chemistry do. We do not know how to apply them systemically beyond the limits of observation to the unobserved or hypothetical instances. These are not laws. What else they may be? What then is their status? To respond to this question is not going to be easy because we do not possess any philosophical account of them which respects them for what they are, rather than treating them as failed attempts at formulations of laws. Some social scientists, it is true, have seen no problem here. Confronted with this kind of consideration, which I have adduced, they thought it was appropriate to apply. What did the social scientists discover are probabilistic generalizations. And where a generalization is only probabilistic, of course, there can only be cases with which counterexamples if the generalizations were non-probabilistic and universal. But this reply misses the point completely. For if this type of generalization, which I have cited, is to be a generalization at all, it must be something more than a mere list of instances. The probabilistic generalization of natural science, those to say of statistical mechanics, are indeed more than this precisely because they are law-like as any non-probabilistic generalization. They possess universal qualifiers. Qualifications is over sets, not over individuals. They entail well-defined sets of counterfactual conditionals, and they are refuted by counterexamples in precisely the same way and to the same degree that other law-like generalizations are. Hence, we throw no light on the status of the characteristic generalization of the social sciences by calling them probabilistic. For they are different from the generalizations of statistical mechanics as they are from the generalizations of Newtonian mechanics or of gas law equations. We therefore have to set out afresh, and to do so to consider whatever the social sciences may not have looked in the wrong place for, their philosophical ancestry as well as their logical structure. It is because modern social sciences have seen themselves as the successors of Comte, Mill, and Buckle, of Helveticus and Diderot and Condorcet, that are Condorcet, I think, that they have presented their writings as an attempt to answer the questions of their 18th and 19th century masters. But let us suppose again that the 18th and 19th centuries, brilliant and creative though they were in fact centuries not as we and they take themselves to be of the Enlightenment, but a particular kind of darkness to which men dazzle themselves so they can no longer see, and ask whether the social sciences might not have an alternative ancestry. The name I wish to invoke is that of Machiavelli, for Machiavelli takes a very different view of the relationship between the explanation and prediction than taken from the Enlightenment. The thinkers of the Enlightenment were infant Hempelins, were infant Hempelins. To explain is, on their view, to invoke a law-like generalization retrospectively. To predict is to invoke a similar generalization prospectively. For this tradition, diminution of predictive failure is the mark of progress in science. And those social scientists who have exposed it must face the fact that if they are right, at some point, an unpredicted war or revolution will become disgraceful for a political scientist, an unpredicted change in the rate of inflation as disgraceful for economists, as would an unpredicted eclipse be for an astronomer. That this has not occurred yet has itself to be explained within the tradition, and the explanations have not been lacking. The human sciences are still in young science, as it is said, but this is clearly false. They are, in fact, as old as the natural sciences. Or it is said that the natural sciences attract the most able individuals in modern culture, and the social sciences only take those not able enough to do natural sciences. This is a claim of H.T. Buckle in the 19th century, and there is some evidence that it is still partly true. A 1960 study of IQ of those competing PhD requirements in various disciplines showed that the natural sciences are significantly more intelligent than the social scientists, although chemists drag down the average of the natural scientists and economists raise the social scientist average. But the same reason that makes me reluctant to judge the deprived minority children by their IQ scores makes me equally reluctant to judge my colleagues by them, or myself. Yet perhaps explanations are not needed. Perhaps the failure that the dominant tradition tries to explain is like King Charles II's dead fish. Charles II once invited members of the Royal Society to explain to him why a dead fish weighs more than the same fish alive. A number of subtle explanations were offered to him. Then he pointed out that it does not. Wherein does Machiavelli differ from the Enlightenment tradition? Above all, in his concept of fortuna. Machiavelli certainly believed, as passionately as any thinker of the Enlightenment, that our investigations should issue in generalizations which may furnish maxims for enlightened practice. But he also believed that no matter how good a stock of generalizations once amassed, and no matter well one reformulated them, the factor of fortuna was ineliminable from human life. Machiavelli believed that we might be able to contrive a quantitative measure of fortuna's influence in human affairs, but this belief, for the moment, I shall set on one side. What I want to emphasize is Machiavelli's belief that, given the best possible stock of generalizations, we may one day be defeated by an unpredicted and unpredictable counterexample, and yet still no way to improve upon our generalizations, and still have no reason to abandon them or even reformulate them. We, by improvements in our knowledge, limit the sovereignty of Fortuna, the bitch goddess of unpredictability, but we cannot dethrone her. If Machiavelli was right, the logical condition of the four generalizations which we inspected would be that which we would expect to hold for the most successful generalizations of the social sciences. It would be in no way a mark of failure, but was he right? I argue that there are four sources of systemic unpredictability in human affairs. The first derives from the nature of radical conceptual innovation. Sir Karl Popper suggested the following example. Sometime in the old Stone Age, you and I are discussing the future, and I predict within the next 10 years, someone will invent the wheel. Wheel, you ask, what is that? And then I describe a wheel to you, finding the words dallies with difficulty for the very first time to say that what a rim, spokes, hub, and perhaps an axle will be. Then I pause aghast, but no one is going to invent the wheel, for I have just invented it. In other words, the invention of the wheel cannot be predicted. For a necessary part of predicting an invention is to say what a wheel is, or it's to say what a wheel is just to invent it. It is easy to see how this example can be generalized. Any invention, any discovery, which consists essentially of an elaboration of a radically new concept, cannot be predicted, for the necessary part of the prediction is the present elaboration of the very concept whose discovery or invention would take place only in the future. The notion of the prediction of a radical conceptual innovation is itself conceptually incoherent. Why do I say radically new rather than just new? Consider the following objection to my thesis. My inventions and discoveries are in fact have been predicted, and these predictions have invoked new concepts. Jules Verne predicted lighter than air flying machines, and so long before him did the anonymous author of the myth of Icarus. Whoever may have been the first predictor of human flight, it may be thought that he or she certainly provides a counterexample to my thesis. But in face of this rejoinder, two points must be made. First is that anyone familiar with the concept of a bird or even a pterodactyl and a machine, the concept of a flying machine involves no radical innovations. It is merely an additive construction from existing stocks of concepts. New, if you like, but not radically new. By saying this, I hope to make the point of saying radically new or radically innovatively clear, and I also make it clear that what has been alleged to be a counterexample is in fact, which is not in fact one. The second point is, although Jules Verne's may have been said to be predicted the invention of aeroplanes or submarines, this is in the same sense of the word as those in Mother Shipton, too, may be said to have predicted the invention of airplanes in the early 16th century. But my present thesis is not concerned with the foretelling, but with the rational ground of prediction, and in its systemic limitations on such a prediction, which I am concerned. What is important about a systemic unpredictability of radical conceptual innovation is, of course, the consequent unpredictability of the future of science. Physicists are able to tell us a good deal about the future of nature in such areas as thermodynamics, but they are able to tell us nothing about the future of physics insofar as the future involves radical conceptual innovation. Yet it is the future of physics which we need to know about if we were to know about the future of our physics-based society. The conclusion that we cannot predict the future of physics is also supported by another argument independent of Popper's. Suppose that someone were to improve computing hardware and software so that it became possible to write a program that would enable a computer to predict, on the basis of the information about the present state of mathematics, the past history of mathematics and the talents and energies of the present day mathematicians, which well-formed formulas in a given branch of mathematics, algebraic topology, say, or number theory, for which at present we possess neither proof nor a proof of their negation, which will receive such a proof within 10 years. We are not requiring the computer to identify all the well-formed formulas, but only some of them. Such a program would have to embody a decision procedure, whereas a subset of well-formed formulas, provable but not yet proven, were discriminated from the set of well-formed formulas. But Church has provided us with the strongest reason for believing that any calculus rich enough to express arithmetic, let alone algebraic topology or number theory, there can be no such decision procedure. Hence, it is a truth of logic that has no such computer has ever been written, and more generally, therefore, it is a truth of logic that the future of mathematics is unpredictable. But if the future of mathematics is unpredictable, so is a great deal else. Consider just one example. It follows from the preceding argument that using Turing proved the theorem which underlies a good deal of modern computing science in the 1930s. Its proof could not have been further rationally predicted unless we count Babbage as a precursor to Turing, but this would not affect the conceptual point. From this, it follows that such subsequent scientific and technological work on computing machines, as depends on the possession of that proof, would have not have been predicted either, but it is just that the work which has shaped so many of our lives. It is, of course, worth noting that Popper's argument holds of any area in which radical conceptual innovation takes place and not just natural science. What made the discoveries of quantum mechanics or special relativity unpredictable before they occurred, also made unpredictable for precisely the same reason the invention of the genre of tragedy at Athens in the late 6th century BC, or the first preachings of Luther's distinctive doctrine of fide sola, are the first elaboration of Kant's theory of knowledge. The striking implication for social life in general are clear, and it is also clear that nothing in these arguments entails that the discovery or radical innovation are inexplicable. Particularly discoveries or innovations may always be explained after the event, although it is not entirely clear what made such explanation would be and whether there would be any. Explanations of the incidence of discovery and innovation in particular periods are, however, not only possible, but for some types of discovery well established on the basis of the work, which goes back to Francis Galton, see De Sola Price, 1963, and the coexistence of unpredictability and explicability holds not just for the first type of systemic unpredictability, but for the three others. The second type of systemic unpredictability to which I now turn is that which derives from the way in which unpredictability of certain of his own future actions by each agent individually generates another element of unpredictability as such in the social world. It is at first sight a trivial truth that when I have not yet made up my mind which of two or more alternatives and mutually exclusive courses of action to take, I cannot predict which I shall take. Decisions contemplated but not yet made by me entail unpredictability of me by me in relevant areas. But this truth seems trivial precisely because what I cannot predict of myself, others may well be able to predict about me. My own future, from the point of view, may be representable only as a set of ramifying alternatives, with each node in a branching system representing a point of yet another unmade decision. Yet unmade decision making. But from the point of view of an adequately informed observer, provided both with the relevant data about me and the relevant stock of generalizations concerning people of my type, my future, so it seems to me to be representable as a determinable set of stages. Yet the difficulty at once arises, for this observer who is able to predict what I cannot is, of course, not able to predict his own future in just the way I am unable to predict mine. And of the features which he will be unable to predict, since it depends on the substantial part upon decisions as yet made by him, it is how far his actions will impact upon and change the decisions made by others, both what alternatives they will choose and what sets of alternatives will be offered for them to choose. Now, among the others is me. It follows that insofar as the observer cannot predict the impact of his future actions on my future decision making, he cannot predict my future actions any more than he can his own. And thus, it clearly holds for all agents and all observers the unpredictability of my future by me does indeed generate an important degree of unpredictability as such. Skip ahead a few sections. A third source of systemic unpredictability arises from game theoretic character of social life. To some theorists in political science, the formal structure of game theory has served to provide a possible basis for the explanatory and predictive theory and incorporating law-like generalizations. Take the formal structure of in-person game. Identify the relevant interests of the players in some empirical situation, and we shall try the very least to be able to predict what alliances and coalitions a fully rational player would enter into, and, as perhaps utopian most, the pressures upon and subsequent behavior of not fully rational players. The recipe and its criticism has inspired some notable work, especially that of William H. Riker, but a large hope that it is embodied in the original optimistic form seems to be illusionary. Consider three types of obstacles to the transfer of formal structures of game theory to the interpretation of actual social and political situations. The first concern the indefinite reflexivity of game theoretic situations. I'm not trying to predict what move you will make. In order to predict this, I must predict what you will predict as to what move I will make. And in order to predict this, I must predict what you will predict about what I will predict about what you will predict, and so on. At each stage, each of us will simultaneously be trying to render himself or herself unpredictable by the other, and each of us will also be relying on knowledge that the other will be trying to make himself or herself unpredictable, informing his or her own predictions. Here, the formal structures of the situation can never be an adequate guide. A knowledge of them may be necessary, but even knowledge of them backed up by a knowledge of each player's interest cannot tell us what simultaneous attempts to render others predictable and others unpredictable will produce. The first type of obstacle may not itself be insuperable. The chances that it will be, however, heightened by the existence of a second type of obstacle. Game theoretic situations are characteristic situations of imperfect knowledge, so this is no accident. For it is a major interest of each actor to maximize the imperfection of the information of certain other actors at the same time as he improves his own. Moreover, a condition of success at misinforming the other actors is likely to be successful production of false information in external observers too. This leads to an interesting inversion of Collingwood's odd thesis that we can only hope to understand the actions of the victorious and the successful, while the conditions of the defeated must remain opaque to us. But if I am right, the conditions of success include the ability to deceive successfully, and hence it is the defeated who are more likely to be able to understand, and it is those who are going to be defeated whose behavior are more likely to be able to predict. Once again, the second type of obstacle may not be insuperable, even in conjunction with the first, but it is yet a third type of obstacle to prediction in game theoretic situations. Consider the following familiar type of situation. The management of a major industry are negotiating the terms of the next long-term contract with the labor union leadership. Representatives of the government are present, not only in arbitrating and mediating role, but because the government has a particular interest in the industry, its products are crucial for defense, say, or in an industry which as powerfully affects the rest of the economy. And at first sight, it ought to be easy to map the situation in game theoretic terms. Three collective players, each with a distinctive interest. But now let us introduce some of these features so that it makes social reality so messy and untidy in contrast with the neat examples in the textbooks. Some of the union leadership are approaching the time when they are going to retire from the post in the union. If they cannot obtain relationships to relatively high-paid jobs with either employers or the government, they may have to return to the shop floor. The employers are not only concerned with the government in its present public interest capacity, they have a long-term concern with obtaining a different type of government contract. One of the representatives of the government is considering running for elective office in the district where the labor vote is crucial. That is to say, in any given social situation, it is frequently the case that there are many different transactions that are taking place at one and the same time between members of the same group. Not one game is being played, but several. And if the game metaphor may be stretched further, the problem about real life is moving one's knight to QB3 may always be replied with a lob across the net. Even when we can identify with some certainty what game is being played, there is another problem. In real life situations, unlike both games and examples in books about game theory, we do not start with a determinate set of players or pieces of a determinate area in which the game is to take place. There is perhaps used to be, on the market, a cardboard and plastic version of the Battle of Gettysburg, which reproduces with great accuracy the terrain, the chronology, and the units involved in the battle. In its particularity, that a moderately good player taking the Confederate side can win. Yet clearly no player of war games is likely to be as intelligent as generalship as Lee was, and he lost. Why? The answer is, of course, that the player knows from the outset that Lee did not. What the time scale of the preliminary stage of battle must be, precisely what units are going to be involved, and what the limits to the terrain are on which the battle is to be fought. And all this entails that the game does not reproduce Lee's situation, for Lee did not and could not know that it was the Battle of Gettysburg, an episode on which the determinate shape was conferred only retrospectively by its outcome, which was about to be fought. Failure to realize this affects the predictive value of many computer simulations which seek to transfer analysis of the past determinate situation to the prediction of a future indeterminate ones. Consider this example from the Vietnam War. Using Lewis F. Richardson's analysis of the Anglo-German naval race in the years before 1914, Jeffrey S. Milstein and William Charles Mitchell constructed a simulation of the Vietnam War, which embodied some of Richardson's generalization. Their prediction failed in two ways. First, they relied on official U.S. naval figures for their statistics about the matter as Viet Cong killings of civilians and number of Viet Cong defectors. Perhaps in 1968, they could not have known what we know now about the systemic falsification of the numbers by the American military in Vietnam. but they have been sensitive in any way to the new players to maximize the imperfection of the information, to which I wrote earlier, they would not have treated the confirming instances of their predictions so confidently. What is striking, however, is that their response to the second source of failure, one which they do note themselves, their predictions were radically upset by the Tet offensive. The response of Milstein and Mitchell is so speculative as to how future studies might be extended so that factors which led to the Tet offensive might be included. What they ignore is the necessarily open and indeterminate nature, indeterminate character of all situations as complex as the Vietnam War. There is at the onset no determinate, innumerable set of factors, the totality of which comprise the situation. To suppose otherwise is to confuse a retrospective standpoint with a prospective one. To say this is not at all to say the same thing as saying that all computer simulations is valueless, but what simulation cannot evade are systemic sources of unpredictability. Now I turn to a fourth source, pure contingency. J.B. Bury once followed Pascal in suggesting that the cause of the foundations of the Roman Empire were at length of Cleopatra's nose. Had her features not been perfectly proportioned, Mark Antony would not have been entranced. Had he not been entranced, he would not have allied himself with Egypt against Octavian. Had he not made that alliance, the Battle of Actium would have not been fought, and so on. One does not need to accept Bury's argument to see the trivial contingencies can powerfully influence the outcome of great events. The molehill which killed William III, or Napoleon's cold at Waterloo, which led him to delegate command to Ney, who in turn had 4 horses shot from under him that day, which led to faults in judgment, most notably sending in the Garde Imperiale 2 hours too late. There is no way in which all such contingencies are moles and bacteria can be allowed for in battle plans. We have then 4 independent but often related sources of systemic unpredictability in human life. It is important to emphasize not only does this unpredictability not entail inexplicability, but its presence is compatible with the truth of determinism in a strong version. Suppose we are able at some future date, and I see no reason why we should not be so, to build and to program computers which are able to simulate wide ranges of human behavior. They are mobile, they acquire, they exchange, and reflect upon information. And they have competitive as well as cooperative goals. They make decisions about alternative courses of action. It is important to recognize that such computers would simultaneously be completely specified mechanical and electronic systems of the determinate kind, and yet would be liable to all 4 types of unpredictability. All of them would be unable to predict the radical conceptual innovation or future proofs in mathematics for precisely the same reasons that we are unable to. Which, by the way, is why I'm skeptical about things like AI. But let's go back to the initial question about the relationship between confusing tactical positions that you make from generalizations from inference. People respond well to invocations of justice, to principles about rooting that in a political and ethical vision required to make it more coherent. The latter is still based on your own hopes and will, based off of what you think is materially possible and conceivable at the time, but you cannot know that until you try it. Where radical new things happen emergent from that, you often cannot know. So coming at someone with the concept of we have to appeal to justice because justice appeals to people, which is basically what you guys are doing, not only conflates the tactical and is Tailism, but also ignores that you haven't defined the course of success of what it means to utilize justice for that. It is not sufficiently delimited, and as such, as a generalization, lacks meaning, and that is not even dealing with the facts of unpredictability that MacIntyre talked about in After Virtue. We'll end here after that long reading, but I hope you understand what I'm getting at. Social scientific generalizations are on frailer ground than we like to admit, and we've had this shown to us over and over again, and yet we like to pretend that they can guide our policy and our rhetorical and tactical orientations, and that our rhetorical and tactical orientations are the same as our principled and systemic or programmatic ones. Though that leads to emotive thinking, Tailism and an inability to transcend the status quo because you've created no system which would create the conditions when reacting to the new and which something new could actually emerge. So every time you regurgitate certain laws, which are just statistical average probabilities, as hard truths of which you must now negotiate, you are also limiting your success criterion to what already exists, making radical politics and radical ethics pretty much meaningless. So, sure, invoke justice, but don't fool yourself that the invocation of justice is even what I'm talking about. That may be a failure on my part or a failure of your part to understand. Probably it's both. But let's ask ourselves here, what is going on? Yes, people appeal to justice, and it might have to do reasons far more simple than the content of social justice or whatever. But since that content is rarely ever laid out and more invoked as a cipher for the feelings of fairness in which justice motivates people, it is easily manipulated, but also has easily has effects, counter reactions, and knock-on effects, and maybe even cascade failures that the people invoking it don't see. So it is insufficient to say that is a way to manipulate the masses, so we must do it. When I am talking about, we have to ground that in something larger, because we have to be able to answer the for whom and the for what and the to whom and the to what questions, which just repeating a sociological generalization, for all its inability to actually deal with the fact that it's not, those generalizations are often not actually truly predictive, leads us to reflect things back as they are. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind your Patreon. Leave a comment if you disagree with me, or you disagree with MacIntyre, or you think I've broken the immortal science of Marxism or the immortal science of sociology or some other shit that you convince yourself to go to bed with. Protect your peace because you're going to need it. Take care.